know, what you hear about when I give brown bag lunches, whatever I happen to be working on at the time, that's what you end up hearing about. It's called killing two birds with one stone, I think. Anyway, today we're going to talk about an early Jackson County, actually Maquuoketa lawyer. His name was J.C. Murray. And he made quite a reputation for himself, both good and bad. So this all kind of came to our attention in January of 2018. And a wonderful lady, young gal, really dynamic young gal, came to visit. She was the curator of the Usher Ferry Historic Village that's owned by the city of Cedar Rapids. And she came to visit our museum and to bring us some artifacts that we're going to talk about today. As you know, Cedar Rapids suffered from devastating floods a few years ago. And she was one of the people that had to put all their museums back together. The village, Usher Village, lost 16 buildings altogether, and they had to move other buildings, but they rebuilt and they moved on and they moved forward. And Mary and I actually attended a Civil War reenactment there a few weeks ago, so they've done a good job of recovering. But it was amazing to me that this curator traveled all the way to Maquuoketa, because she brought us some artifacts that she thought were very important. So important she felt like she wanted to bring them herself. And though they had had them for many years, when she was moving things and reevaluating and redoing things, she determined that these more belonged in our collection in Jackson County. Did not know for sure why they had them. But most of this centered around this attorney, J.C. Murray. And so neither of us knew it when we were talking then, but before that we had received a letter from them looking for information about J.C. Murray. And one of the 16 buildings, I think one of the ones that was destroyed, was their village lawyer house, they called it. And they were doing an exhibit about J.C. Murray for that. So we had already, Belle Tubbs and Maxine Reisdorfer, had already done some research and sent them information, and that's in the Genie files. Okay, so my little changer isn't working, and this doesn't work very well, but bear with me. So one of the things that she brought us, and probably the most significant thing, and no doubt the reason for her trip here, was this sensational trial that took place in Jackson County courts and Jackson County District Court in the 1890s into the 1900s. And among these, most of the law firms in Maquuoketa were involved in this very, very special case. J.C. Murray and Farr, J.L. Johnson, Hayes and Schuler, Levi Keck, D.A. Weinkoop, and A.L. Bartholomew. All different law firms were all working on this case. And then the opposing attorneys, just to show you how big this case was, the opposing attorneys were W.C. Gregory, L.A. Ellis, Joe R. Lane, remember that name, F.D. Keeley, B.F. Thompson, and an attorney by the name of W.J. Waters. And this case was appealed all the way up to the Iowa Supreme Court in the May session of 1898. Well, in the last little while, two researchers have come to us looking for information about these cases, which is probably why we're having a brown bag lunch about it. So I'm going to share it with you again. But some of the things that she brought us were this white notebook up here entitled John Calvin Murray's Archives, 1883 to 1939. And it contains a lot of well-curated letters relating both to his law practice and land speculations and his interest in livestock. So all this information you're free to look at, and it's really very, very interesting. There's also a photo album that I'll show you some slides from, and just a few other things, and then boxes of miscellaneous court records. And I think that Norma has scanned most of these things into our database a while back, and I'm sure as she was doing that, she memorized them all. So I'll probably have to call on her for help with this. Okay, so first of all, let's just look quickly at this interesting Maquuoketa man, John Calvin Murray, okay? He was a man of many facets. His father was Dr. George Murray, and he was born in Pennsylvania in 1815, studied medicine in Cincinnati, got his medical license in 1845, and then they moved to Maquuoketa in 1855, really early in our history. So George was one of the early doctors here. And the family lived in this brick house, which this is a fascinating old picture, so look at it very closely. This is a brick house that was on East Platte Street, and as you can see the brick house on one side and the Congregational Church, now the UCC Church, right, on the opposite side. So the caption on the photo said that the brick house was owned by William Gibson, my grandfather, great. And but I don't think any of us were around to remember when the UCC Church had a house beside it, because this is very, very early. The family lived there in this house, the Murray family, until they moved to a farm about 2.5 miles outside of Maquuoketa, and there Dr. Murray had herds of several hundred sheep, and he raised sheep. So the youngest of his 5 children is the guy we're talking about today, John Calvin Murray. He was born in Pennsylvania in 1854, before they came here in 1855. He attended Jackson County schools, but then he went back to Pennsylvania, where he graduated from high school. He went on to study at Cornell College, and he taught at the Bellevue school system for 4 or 5 years, and he even became their superintendent of schools. So he was a well-educated guy and had done many things. And then he took up law, and he graduated from the law department, that's what they called it back then, at the University of Iowa in the class of 1884. And there was another Maquuoketan, a classmate of his, whose name was Charles Farr. And they graduated at the same time, came back to Maquuoketa, and together they opened this law firm known as Murray and Farr. And so back to the case in question that went all the way to the Supreme Court. When this curator brought me all of this information that you see up here, she said, should I read this information over the weekend, it would be some very spicy entertainment. And indeed it was, as Norma found out as she was memorizing all this. Okay? But as I was reading it, it just reminded me of, you know, some of our early settlers, and when they were setting up the library in Maquuoketa, we have a wonderful library, and its history goes way, way back. And the people who set up the library thought that people who wasted their time reading novels or fiction were not in their right minds. They thought that reading was supposed to be more serious, and that's the way. Well, I decided that after reading this, nobody needed to read novels. It was all just going on right here under people's noses. Okay, so the first, this is difficult. I'm missing a picture. Okay, so this extraordinary case, this happening, took place in the old Decker house. And I know you've seen this picture before, but this little white building right here, that is the first Decker house. The first Decker was a white framed building. It was built, I'm not sure when it was built, but most of this event took place there, right? Maquuoketa was founded in 1838. And during the 1840s and 1850s, as you can imagine, there were not many houses here. There were not places for people to live as they kept moving in. And so people just typically lived in a hotel. There was the Decker Hotel, the Goodnow Hotel, and there were several boarding houses at that time. And that's where families would live, either until, until they could afford to build a home of their own, or until houses were built that they could rent and they could find a place to live. We've even talked about several people on the outskirts of town that lived in tents just over the winter, cold Iowa winters, and their families lived in tents until they could get a cabin built. Well, living in the Decker Hotel, the little white building that you see there, there was a man by the name of Mott Watson. and he also had an office in this hotel. Okay, he was single, a bachelor. He was a notary, a realtor, an insurance man, and a land speculator. He was a businessman that had a sterling reputation, and he was amassing quite a fortune, even back in that time. And in 1891, reportedly, according to the newspapers, though I couldn't find out what happened to it, he had started work on a substantial 2-story brick office and residence, also on North Main Street, but I don't know which one that is. So, you have Mott Watson living in the old Decker Hotel, and then add to the picture a young woman by the name of Mary Jones. Mary Jones, according to newspaper accounts, and this is the Cedar Rapids newspaper, was a hotel maid who was in the habit of visiting the rooms of Watson on errands other than her domestic duties. And other accounts that we find in all of this paperwork that we have, people have signed affidavits saying, no, Mary never even worked there. But as it went along, Mary found herself in a family way, and she checked into a local boarding house, but she had no money to pay, and finally was taken by the sheriff out to the county home, to the poor farm, okay? She arrived there with no trunk, in dire straits, no money at all, and so the matron sewed clothes for her. And her son was born there late in December of 1869. And we believe that probably he was placed in the cradle that came from the county home that we have over in the other museum. So in March of 1870, when this little baby boy was about 3 months old, he was taken back to the Decker Hotel by his mother, Mary Jones. And there, Mott Watson, in his office, drew up a contract. And the child was adopted by Mrs. Niles. And it was Mrs. Niles and her husband who were the proprietors of the Decker Hotel at that time. They gave him the name of George D. Niles. And right after that, Mary Jones disappeared from our picture, and nobody has heard from her again. So there's a lot of allegedlys in this story, lots of different things to look at. Allegedly, Mott had given the adopted parents written confirmation of his parentage and an agreement that he would provide for the child, and supposedly saw the child every day until 1873, when the Niles family moved to Kansas. As time went along, Mrs. Niles became ill, and she reportedly, according to all these documents, which Norma has memorized, she was delirious much of the time, and she destroyed a lot of the important things and paperwork that she had. So all of a sudden, there's no longer any paperwork. And she died when George was 18 years old. By and by, her husband remarried, and George then entered the military in Kansas, serving in the U.S. Cavalry unit from Kansas. So time marches on again. It's 22 years after all of this happens. Mott Watson died intestate on August 26th of 1895 at the age of 67 years. He left property estimated to be worth $270,000. Now, if you convert that to today's money, that would be $7,521,674.30. But there was testimony in all of this paperwork that Norma memorized. There was testimony that several of his relatives had opened his safe and removed some of the documents. Okay? His estate was claimed by his sister, I think the only remaining of his brothers and sisters, his sister's children, and the children and grandchildren of his deceased brothers and sisters. So when you tally this all up, there's about 30 heirs that are claiming part of this $7 million, right? And so because there were so many heirs, there were a lot of lawyers and a lot of law firms involved, okay? So they thought that they had everything well under control until a newspaper notice came along saying who the attorneys were, etc., etc. And then a handsome 22-year-old George Niles Watson, honorably discharged from the service, miraculously turned up, claiming to be the illegitimate son of Mott Watson. Well, as you can imagine, this ignited a long fight with Watson's 30 nieces and nephews. The case was fought over a long period of time, all the way from the lower courts, all the way through the district courts, landing in the Supreme Court of Iowa. Okay? Well, the first go-round, the first trial, the nephews won. But then there was some discrepancy, and there was the second round, and on the second round, Niles Watson won. Well, after the second verdict, and he was feeling very confident, he returned to Texas, and Kansas, and he re-enlisted in the cavalry, and he was sent to the Philippines, where he was made a captain. And he failed to show up for the third round of court proceedings. We don't really know whether he never got word, he couldn't come back. We don't know what happened, but because he didn't show up, the judge immediately ruled in the favor of the 30 nieces and nephews. And though his lawyers appealed immediately, his appeal was denied. And this is all according to the Cedar Rapids Gazette, okay? The Bellevue Herald-Leader of October 27th of 1896 wrote, finally, Watson case is closed, okay? Jackson County's famous $300,000 case awaits Judge Waterman's decision. And it went on to say, last Thursday, one of the most remarkable cases that was ever heard in the state of Iowa was closed in Judge Waterman's court. And the claimant of the fortune of $300,000, now $7 million, awaits a decision. 52 trial days were occupied. So this Iowa Supreme Court case took 52 days to try. No less than 407 witnesses were heard, including depositions. So that tells you a little bit about what was going on all this time. George Niles Watson, the plaintiff, claims to be the legitimate son of Mott Watson, deceased, and consequently he's entitled to the fortune that Mott Watson left, amounting to the figure that we need. Whether he shall have proven his case or not, the paper said, remains to be seen, and public opinion is divided as to the merits of this case. Well, 407 witnesses, that was just about everybody in Jackson County, I think, and everybody had something to say about it. But paperwork that we have gone through shows that there was all kinds of skullduggery on both sides of this case. We find evidence that many witnesses were paid to testify in a certain way. And we even find that some people were hauled off to Illinois and put up in a hotel until the trial was over to keep them silent so they couldn't testify. Lots of really, really strange things went on. Okay, so here's Charles M. Waterman. He was the judge of the Iowa Supreme Court at the time. He presided over the case. So he was born in Kentucky, but he lived in Davenport. January 1st of 1898, he began his service on his court. So our Maquuoketa case was one of the very first cases that he tried here. And another thing I found interesting is that in June of 1902, that's just 4 years, right? 4 years after this judge resigned and went into practice with Joe R. Lane of Davenport, who, I said, remember that name? He was one of the attorneys for the family. Some very strange things. So here are the headlines. The court decision. Now, we talked about this case back in 2018 a little bit, when we didn't really know what had happened, and we were going to have a second brown bag lunch, and Ken Wright was going to give it, and he was going to talk about the case and who the winner was, you know, who reigned supreme, etc., etc. Well, that never happened. But we do now know, at least a little bit, we know that Mott Watson did not win this case. All of the money went to the nieces and the nephews. Part of the reason that we couldn't find out what happened was that all of the Iowa Supreme Court records are not yet online. They're still putting them online. We could find the early records. We even have a lot of them right here, but we didn't have the end ones that we needed. So now we know what happened, and the family prevailed, and the siblings got the fortune. And then there was an interesting note posted on Ancestry.com. I don't know whether maybe Don found this, I'm not sure. It was written by Irma Watson, and it was entitled Mott Watson and the Red Chest. Now this is on Ancestry.com. In 1895, a very rich uncle of my father died. He left a red chest about 3 foot long, 1.5 or 2 feet high. They just thought it was full of clothes. But when they opened it, they found that it was full of money. The chest was full of pockets made of wood, and each pocket had a lid hinged on. He must have made it all. Each pocket was full of $1,000 bills, and of all different amounts, she says. There was a fortune in that box, and it had to be divided between my dad and his 2 brothers, Edgar and Leslie Watson. And our family was quite wealthy from then on. Well, a couple years ago, the Historical Society started exchanging information with a man by the name of Jarrett Robinson. And he was interested in George Niles Watson. He was researching him through the 20th Kansas Infantry and his service records. And so that's how he found us and became involved. So we traded information back and forth. And he was interested in all the little details of the Decker Hotel and all of the things that happened, because he said it better helped him understand the character of George Niles Watson. And so part of this is the information that he gave to us. And he furnished us with several letters that the illegitimate son wrote from the Philippines to our J.C. Murray. And those letters he wrote between 1896 and 1902 as they were trying to finish this up. He sent us these pictures of George Niles Watson when he was in the cavalry. He sent several military photos and some information. He said that Captain Watson traveled all over the world, and sometimes he served under different names. And I thought that that was interesting, because the military was very strict about things like that. But he said sometimes he served under different names, serving in the Boer War. He found that he had been selling horses to the British military at some point, and that and he claimed to be at Custer's Last Stand, though he had already disproven that. He said that he was really almost part of Wounded Knee. And I know you've heard that before, because we talked a lot about the rifles from Wounded Knee that were in Maquuoketa for some time, and kind of why we got our sword back, because of the rifles from the Battle of Wounded Knee. Well, he was not there, but evidently he was on his way there. The Army was sending him there, the cavalry unit, before that took place, but it happened just before he got there. He came to the conclusion that our Captain Watson was not the most competent fellow, that he was brought before a military board of inquiry by the 20th Kansas in San Francisco, and that he barely survived this inquiry. They almost threw him out of the military. But the lieutenant colonel was a personal friend and kind of saved his career. So the last we heard from Jarrett, he was requesting George's military record from the National Archives, saying that he thought that it was going to be a soap opera for sure. So we haven't heard from him since, but that's when everything was closed down because of COVID. So he definitely described George as a scallywag. One of the things he said was that he had a number of wives. He said he was definitely a bigamist and probably a polygamist, and he had his Maquuoketa wife, he had an Abilene wife, and a California wife, sort of all at the same time. And then he said he wasn't sure that he really meant to do this. It was just he was moving around and it just happened. But he also said that he skipped the country going to South Africa. And one of the things he was researching was trying to find out why he went to South Africa, how he got there, what his service was like there and what he did when he got back. But he knew that he was gone to South Africa for about a year, and he thinks that that's the same time period when all 3 wives were hunting him down. So quite the character, our George. Okay. So if we go back to our friend, the curator, who brought us some very nice artifacts, and talking a little more about J.C. Murray, she brought us this neat little paper pocket wallet. And evidently this is something that they had a lot of back in the day. It was an advertising gimmick, I'm sure, for Dr. Joseph Haas. And he had, as you can see, hog and poultry remedies. But many of the letters that we have from J.C. Murray mention his dealings with this man. So maybe he had remedies for some of his other animals. He also brought us, or sent us, we also have of his, a wonderful little photo album. Looks like this. And I'd just like to show you a couple, 3 or 4 of the photos that are in this album, because we're still trying to figure out where they are, what they are, and they're just interesting. So the first one is this photograph that's obviously Main Street in Maquuoketa, right? And it's just, we had never seen this photograph before, and it's just quite interesting. There's a man sitting on top of the awning right there, I just noticed. You can look at this photo for a long time and keep seeing different things, I have found. The next photograph was this one that we thought was strange. Now that's obviously Maquuoketa. They must have hauled in a log cabin for some reason and left it in the middle of the street. I don't know whether it was some kind of a celebration. Have you ever seen this photo before? Does anybody know anything? It's advertising a log cabin supper, June 15th, for the benefit of the Fountain Fund. Okay, Don.
From a street fair in 1902.
Is it? Was it in that book? Okay. So the fact that they are advertising for the Fountain Fund, is this the fountain that they were putting in Mount Hope Cemetery? Okay. So this was the second photo in his book. Thank you.
What does it say on the bottom? Ice? Is the ice cream extra or something?
Yes, I think so. Ice cream is extra.
Okay.
Doesn't come with a meal. Done?
And that the other photo was of a street fair in 1912.
1912? Okay.
You should remember this.
I should. He's right, I should. Okay, but with me it's one fact in and one fact out, you know how that is. Okay, so now we studied this photo quite a bit. There's a reason that there's a bovine in the picture. But for a while we thought that that was the old sanitarium, Reynolds Mansion on Summit Street. But we weren't able to decide that for sure, right?
I think there's no doubt.
Okay. So why he had one of his cattle there, we don't really know.
Where exactly was that?
So it's on West Summit Street, right? It's not there any longer.
Right.
But it was the Iowa Sanitarium, or the Joe Reynolds Mansion is what it was called.
So it would have been right west of the high school. It's set on a 27.5-acre lot. And if I'm not mistaken, that's one of the roast beer bowls.
I thought they were all black.
What color is that?
That's brown.
Yeah, it's brown.
I think because this is J.C. Murray's, it's not. But it could be.
Yeah, but wasn't it that other breed?
J.C.
I looked it up, and it's 2 breeds mixed from.
That's J.C. Murray's, and that's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
And that's why I think this picture is, this photograph is there. Okay, now we get kind of lost. Look at that barn. Does anybody have any idea where that barn might be? We don't know that it's in Jackson County. Maybe it's not. Probably it's not. But does anybody have any clues about that magnificent I mean, I assume it's barn, right? So, again, why would this be in J.C. Murray's little photo album? Okay, and now we see J.C. Murray with some of his cattle. They're American red-polled cattle, and Nancy's right. He imported two, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but he imported two different cattle, a dairy cow, and something that was raised for beef. And they put them together to make a breed called the Red-Polled Cattle Club.
Well, I hate to tell you this, but he's not getting credit for that on Wikipedia.
I know, I've already checked that.
It
But
says developed in England.
well, they had them in England. He's the first person that brought the two to Maquuoketa, yeah, he did, to Maquuoketa, and started the herds here. Okay, so, and there's just 4 other pictures that I just put together of these cattle that are, again, in his scrapbook. So the story is, and this came from the 1889 Jackson County Portrait and Biographical Album, okay? This is what they said about J.C. Murray. Besides speculating, I need to go one more picture. Besides speculating in Western lands, Mr. Murray in 1884 organized the American Red-Polled Cattle Club, and from a small beginning of 7 members has increased the society until there are now, in 1889, over 400 owners and breeders of this new and popular breed of cattle. In 1886 to 87, Murray had made the trip across the water and imported both cattle of his favorite breed and also the first Suffolk punch horses ever brought to the state of Iowa. He has edited the American Red-Polled Herd book, which is what is being talked about here, and he's currently engaged in bringing out a 2nd volume of the same work. So that's, as I understand it, kind of a pedigree book of pedigree cattle, where they keep track of, like racehorses, they keep track of everything. So he was very, very involved in that. Red-polled cattle were concentrated mostly in the Midwest. They continue to thrive today on many American family farms. Some of them have owned red polls for 4 or 5 generations, but most of those are in the Midwest. And so, to Don's point, I think, okay, so we have these fascinating breeds that have been brought here. We were known as the red-polled capital of the country, Jackson County. And then we have Otto Battles with his Angus cattle that were so famous. What happened to all that? We now have none.
He also had Hereford cattle.
True. So, yes. Okay, so the other thing that J.C. Murray, did with his time was his fascination with Suffolk punch horses. And so Phil Gent and I researched these pretty heavily. But take a look at this picture. We think that this picture is in the Second Ward Park in Maquuoketa, with a little diagonal sidewalk, etc. We don't know this for sure. It kind of looks like it, you think, Barb? It looks like it could be. The First Ward Park also had that little diagonal sidewalk. Okay, so going back to the Jackson County Portrait and Biographical Album, they also added that there can be no doubt that the success of importing and improving on a large scale 2 new breeds of domestic animals, connected with the editing of a technical work such as the American Herd Book, coupled with success in various and more common commercial enterprises, entitles Mr. Murray to be known by the slang Western appellation, a rustler. So evidently that was a complimentary term. Okay, so this photo is there because this is the 1907 Maquuoketa homecoming was a huge event here. And this is the committee of very important people that planned that. Swigert of the Maquuoketa Sentinel and G.L. Mitchell, very, very important people. So they planned this committee. I think you'd have to admit that J.C. Murray would be described today as a type A personality, right? He was this lawyer that was involved in all kinds of things. He was extremely successful, made a great deal of money in land speculation and all that sort of thing. And then he had this intense interest in agriculture as far as animals are concerned. But he also did a lot of public speaking, and he was sought after as a speaker, and he was known to be the life of the party. And so the Homecoming Committee of 1907 secured him as the speaker for their main speaker. And J.W. Ellis described it in this Maquuoketa homecoming that was held in the armory here. He said, J.C. Murray thought it was a good time to stir up the animals, and he proceeded to belabor some of the speakers in a humorous and caustic personal manner. It must have been a little bit like a roast, I'm thinking, is what he was doing. For a minute or two, it looked as though the fun was coming fast and furious, but it was all in the game and made for lively entertainment. He also added, he must have been known as a ladies' man, however, because in one of his talks, he was described as good-naturedly sandwiching in between a few comments to the ladies. J.W. Ellis also reported on the big Bellevue homecoming of 1907, and J.C. Murray was also the main speaker at that, and there you see a picture of that. So, again, he was just this bigger-than-life kind of person. Everybody knew who he was involved in everything, and very successful. But according to our friend Jarrett, he was a little less successful in his personal life. So J.C. Murray was married to Jessie Drummond on June 21st of 1879. This comes from the Jeannie files. They were the parents of 4 children, Mary, Jay, Jean, and Alan. But then he divorced Jessie and he ran off with his secretary, Bernice Allen, who he married in 1914. And there are many interesting letters written by Grace Hallahan, former curator and super sleuth, in the Jeannie files at this time. So Grace's mother, it turns out that Grace's mother and Jessie were neighbors, and they were great friends. And her mother did not like J.C. at all, as you would think. And she said that even the dog hated him, and wouldn't let him out of the car when he came to visit. And he had to drive all the way to the barn in order to even talk to his brothers. So, and the other thing he said is it's also very obvious that Attorney Murray did not like being on the other side of the scandal, as in Murray versus Taylor, because he actually sued the bishop of the Episcopal Church. This is the top bishop of the Episcopal Church in Portland, Oregon in 1915. And this is what that newspaper said. The bishop will in all probability go to Maquuoketa, Jackson County, Iowa, from Portland, Oregon, to answer this libel suit for $50,000 brought last January by John Calvin Murray, an Iowa attorney. The bishop had, according to those who brought the suit, made certain remarks for which he was asked to apologize. The trouble originated when Mr. Murray was married about 2 years ago in Dean Sumner's Cathedral in Chicago, big cathedral in Chicago. The marriage, it was said, was contrary to the rules of the Episcopal Church, as Mr. Murray was a divorced man. And the bishop at the time, Dean Sumner, defended the rector, who it was reported did not know that Mr. Murray had been divorced. And incidentally, it was added that the dean had cast certain aspersions upon the lawyer. So he did not like to be the underdog. He did not like to be the bad guy. One last picture of J.C. Murray. Okay, he passed away. J.C. Murray passed away in Iowa City, December 28th of 1925. His obituary lists Bernice that he ran away with, the surviving widow, and then lists 2 sons, Justin and Eugene, and a daughter, Mary. So maybe Justin is from the second marriage, it's because he wasn't listed before. One of the comments from our friend Jarrett was that George Niles Watson was even more of a scoundrel than this attorney, because it seems that Murray's son Justice, and he also had a brother named Justice, but he must have named his son after his brother, who was living in Evansville, Indiana, murdered his wife's lover, and his dad, J.C. Murray, got together a battery of lawyers and got him completely off the hook. So that was his ending story. So that's just a little bit about our type A personality, J.C. Murray. Did a lot of neat things, but maybe some not so neat things. And some of the spicy scuttlebutt that went on in Jackson County back in around the time of the 1900s. Okay, so Don?
So when you get back to Niles Watson,
Niles Watson.
did anybody get paid with the lawyers out of that?
Yes, all the money paid, all the money went to the nieces and nephews.
I'm just saying, the legal bills must have been
All the legals,
astronomical.
and I'm sure they did, because lawyers always get their money first, you know how that is.
That's my point, yeah.
Yeah, so, but according to the, yeah, they made a lot of money. All the family, because back then, that was a lot of money. Sue?
Back to that about the fountain, I know in one of my presentations,
Uh-huh.
one of the women's group claimed that they paid for that fountain with their money.
Well,
So was there another fountain maybe in Maquuoketa?
you know, and that's possible, I'm just assuming that that's the fountain, but it would only make sense that there were more than one person contributing, more than one group contributing to that, and maybe, whoops, wherever that picture is, maybe they are, let's find that picture again, there it is, maybe they're the ones that put on this, maybe they put on this dinner, this log cabin supper, maybe they're the ones that put it on to raise the money to pay for it. That's a possibility. But if you ever find any more, let us know, because it should, it should go in the files. Anyway, we have tons of accession information about this very spicy trial. And if you would like a weekend to borrow it and read it, you certainly may. It is very interesting, to say the least. Okay, any other questions?
Explain
Jerry.
the the homecomings back then. Obviously, it's not a school thing because there were kids in there. Was that a once-a-year thing?
It was an old settler kind of thing, to my knowledge. The old settlers by then were getting old and we were losing them. But old settlers had homecomings back then where they all gathered together. Ones that moved away came from great distances to attend those. And they were huge. Thousands of people would come to them. So they were huge things.
But not a yearly thing?
I don't think a yearly thing.
So part of it was too, that a lot of the early settlers, after the Civil War, they opened up the land out west for $1.25 an acre, so they
Correct.
sold out to the Germans who were coming in and moved further west and bought bigger farms. So by 1902, there would be a lot of those that moved to California or someplace,
Right.
and they came back.
But it was amazing, as you read, and in the Annals of Jackson County, the 7 volumes, they have long sections about the old settlers meetings, and it's amazing when you read the list of people that came back to go to those. I mean, in my mind, it was very difficult and expensive to travel back then. But these people just seemed to flock back for those meetings, and they always had sometimes they were week-long events, weren't they?
Right.
They were huge events. And they got the biggest speakers they could find from all around, and really, really partied on. But it was their chance to come back and see their old friends, and probably part of their families that they left behind and whatnot. So they were really big deals.
But they were in a group of people, they were the only people that had their memories.
Yes.
Like a high school reunion. Nobody else has those memories
Right.
of those people. And that's what they wanted to come back and relive.
Right. So they were big events, huge events. Okay, anything else? Thank you very much.